War today is no longer confined to the battlefield. It is fought in the cloud, in algorithms, and in the minds of citizens scrolling their phones. A fake video can sway an election. A satellite constellation can decide whether an army has comms or goes dark. AI can scan faces in a crowd as easily as it can target an enemy on the front line. But alongside this digital front, the physical battlefield is also changing, and the defining weapon of the 21st century is the drone. Small, silent, and cheap, drones are forcing the world to rethink what war looks like.
Across Ukraine, Gaza, and Sudan, we've seen drones do what artillery and infantry once did. They scout, they strike, they disrupt. What makes them different is their accessibility. A state military or militia commander can acquire them at a fraction of the cost of traditional hardware. For Africa, where conflict has always been shaped by mobility and improvisation, drones are both an opportunity and a threat.
From the Sahel to the Horn of Africa, governments are investing heavily in surveillance and strike drones. At least 31 African states have acquired this technology, but so have non-state actors. Militias are strapping grenades to commercial helicopters. External groups are spreading propaganda as effectively as they fly drones. And mercenaries are leveraging foreign tech to kill local conflicts. The monopoly of the state of violence and even untruth has never looked weaker.
So the real question isn't whether Africa will face modern warfare. It already is. The question is whether drones and digital weapons become instruments of sovereignty and stability, or whether they turn the continent into a testing ground for global powers and private actors who care more about influence than peace.
To help us think this through, we're joined by two voices who know this landscape firsthand. Ralph Goff, who spent 35 years with the CIA, including frontline experience in Ukraine, where the future of warfare is already unfolding, and Colonel Seth Shava, a seasoned military strategist who has studied how drones are enhancing Africa's skies and the security calculus.
From Cairo to Cape Town, Lagos to Lamu, 54 nations, one continent, countless perspectives. Hi, I'm Waweru Njoroge.
Hi, I'm Okoh.
Welcome to Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens. This is the podcast where we unpack power, policy, people, and the paradoxes that define our time. With nuance, with history, and with a deliberate commitment to context. This isn't punditry, it's perspective. It's not a briefing, it's a reframing, and it starts right here.
And one of our most watched episodes was with Colonel Shava, and he's already here with us again today to have another conversation. And thanks so much for being here, Colonel.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump straight into it, basically, and look at the continent. For decades, basically, African conflicts were defined by things like nimble ground units, rather pickup trucks, you've got AK-47s and everything. But drones are now changing that narrative, changing the playbook, as it were. In 2024 alone, Ethiopia carried out 54 drone strikes. Mali did 62. Burkina Faso did 82. And Sudan, a staggering 266 drone strikes. In 2023, the FPV, basically the first-person view drone revolution, basically changed tactics. Small first-person view drones now hunt and actually target with surgical precision, right? And if we look beyond Africa, the picture is even starker. In Ukraine, analysts estimate that 70% of battlefield injuries are now caused by drones. So my question to you is this: how are African armies training to counter first-person view tactics? And do we even have the jammers or the tactics yet in that content?
I don't think the African armies are training to counter those. This is a brand new phenomenon in warfare. So, and we are actually the first time seeing it in Ukraine. It's not an old thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we are learning a lot from the Ukraine-Russia warfare war in terms of drones and what role they're playing in the battlefield. Like you say, they've changed the nature of the battlefield, the front line of the battlefield. So it's a new phenomenon, and yeah, we are still learning and watching what's happening out there.
So we're going to be playing catch-up? Or how do we get ahead of it rather than playing catch-up?
Well, we've always played catch-up, and there's nothing wrong with catching up. You grow faster when you're catching up. These guys have done through a lot of prototyping, testing, and all that. By watching them, we forego those stages of development and we go straight to the product. So there's nothing wrong with that, and saves costs.
Well, looking at warfare today, you don't have to be on the battleground to fight a war anymore. And so when we look at sophisticated warfare, as it were, and looking at the numbers that Waweru talked about in different parts of the continent, are we at the point whereby you can say the sophistication of warfare is now what is being employed by Africa? Are we fighting tomorrow's war with yesterday's ammunition?
In my opinion, the drone is a force multiplier. It's not a replacement. If you were to look at the situation in Ukraine with a small army of maybe 150,000 troops versus Russia with about 1.5 million troops, they cannot go man to man. Yeah, and the long border that they have. So to fill in the gaps, they brought in the FPV drone, which has reduced the number of people required in the war front. But the nature of the war is that the Ukrainians are in the defense. Whether you can have the same application in attack, we haven't tested that yet.
Okay.
Yeah. So we see what it can do when you're in defense. But whether it can actually go take ground, I don't think it's possible. You still need human beings.
Earlier we were talking about, this was off before we started the show. I was lamenting that anytime I hear the word drone, the only thing I think is weddings, crop dusting, geothermal well seeking, basically, and delivery of packages, and those kind of things. So that speaks to the fact that not all drones are actually created equal, right? At one end of the spectrum, you have the Turkish Bayraktars. That's what it is. Yeah, the Bayraktars, basically. And these things can fly actually 24/7 and carry heavy payloads. And then you have other drones which are much cheaper, basically, which are disposable as well, and which are very widely available. And in between that aspect of the Turkish and the cheap end ones, you have the ones that are the Chinese. These are the Winglong. You also have the Iranian Shaheds as part of that whole mix of drones. And these actually have become more prevalent and more staple, basically, in a lot of governments who are priced outside of the Western kits, basically. On the continent right now, we have 31 Africans who now own drones. 31 African governments now own drones. And around 200 new drones are being added every single year. Now, with regards to what we've talked about, the Turkish, the Western, the ones in between, does this uneven access, right, risk creating dangerous imbalances between states?
Even the traditional Air Force, not all of us were equipped the same. Others have more ability in terms of finances to acquire better airplanes than others. Others don't even have. Yeah, that imbalance continues, whether you bring in a drone, or a fighter aircraft. It continues, and it has been part of Africa. The air forces are very expensive things. So probably the introduction of drones, which are much cheaper, will allow African countries to increase their air power through drones.
Okay.
Other than buying fighter jets.
Okay, I'm going to say Gaza will come up, Ukraine will come up a lot in these conversations about drones, especially because they're the ones who seem to be setting the pace in terms of how the technology is advancing and how it's actually being used, which basically then also lends itself to what I, for lack of a better word, bandits, as it were. So I've got a government that no longer monopolizes the skies. And the reason why that can happen is because obviously, and this is according to the ACLED, there are 9 non-state actor groups that are already operating drones across Africa, right? Not necessarily government sanctioned or government involved. In Ukraine, analysts estimated that tactical drones account for about 60 to 70% of destroyed systems on the front line. They've become the main killers of equipment as well as soldiers. Now, this is a serious threat when militias and extremist groups in Africa can field the same weapons as a national army.
They can get your normal drone and do some modification on it, put a camera on it or something like that, just for surveillance. But whether they can actually get an armed drone, I doubt whether we're there yet.
Okay, so it's not...
There are new players in the market, of course, like you said, the Turkish, the Iranians, who are now making armed drones, and they've got less restrictions on them. That's why you'll see a lot of those, especially in Africa. And even in Ukraine, they're flying a lot of those. Like even Russia is flying a lot of those.
Okay.
Shahid is Russia's main drone. The Ukrainians are flying the Turkish one. In fact, it was the first armed drone they had. Yeah. There are new players coming in that market now. Not necessarily the big boys. And even those guys, I don't think they're selling to just anybody. They only sell to government.
But does it open up the scope? Does it widen the scope then for who then will then be able to engage in this field when it then comes to, again, sophisticated tactical warfare? Does it allow other people to then enter into this field because there are newer entrants into the market opening up the provider base?
But other people, the governments are free to make their own drones. Yeah. If the Kenya Air Force wants to, or Kenya Army wants to make drones, the technology is available. It's up to you to
invest in it.
Invest in it. There's no restrictions on who can have drones and who cannot. To me, it's cheaper to invest in drones than to invest in fighter airplanes.
It is much cheaper, yes.
Fighter airplanes are very expensive. But from what you're seeing in Ukraine, the drones are catching up with the fighter aircraft in terms of performance, military performance there, in other words. The Ukrainians are using drones now for strategic bombings, hitting the Russian airfields, nodes, factories. They're attacking the Russian military production complex, using drones. In the past, you needed a fighter plane to do that, but now it's possible to do it with drones at a much cheaper cost. But it's up to the African countries to go into their own drone production.
Actually, now speaking of that, 13 African companies are producing at least 35 models. These are countries like Egypt, Sudan, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and Ethiopia, who are already responsible for about 12% of the drone sales to African governments. Yeah. So with regards to this kind of local industry, does it mark the beginning of real-time self-reliance on us creating our own drones for the African continent? And will African militaries remain tied to foreign supplies, or will they remain tied to foreign suppliers for most of the critical systems? One of the critical systems you mentioned was the motherboards that were being made from, those are critical systems. So
semiconductors.
So yeah, semiconductors go in motherboards. So if we're to look at we need the critical components from people, we can assemble them.
But that's not true either. When they talk about Kenya as the Silicon Valley, and these are Americans who talk about Kenya as the Silicon Valley, we're making those boards here.
Well, we're meant to be.
No, we are.
Well,
yeah, we are. There's
I know one company that's doing motherboards.
Factory
Yeah.
That's doing motherboards that they're making for the big boys. Okay, I don't think they will refuse to make motherboards for Kenya if you ask them to do.
Sure.
So the capacity is there. I think we have the knowledge and capacity.
I want to shift gears a bit. Now, there's an analyst called Alessandro Arudino who says the future of African conflict is being built on 3 specific pillars: mercenaries, drones, and false information. We've already seen how drones reshape battlefields. We've been talking about it with the Ukraine. It's also happening in Gaza. But the next step might actually be a bit more unsettling. Like I mentioned, Ukraine, Gaza. Drones are now being powered or being paired with AI. And we had a conversation on 54. Thank you, Samoina, so much for hosting that conversation on. But now they're being paired with AI in terms of being able to target much more surgically. They can now do facial recognition. They can now do autonomous flight, which has already been there. But with AI component, it means that you don't have to necessarily always be looking to the skies.
Yeah.
Right? Sea drones now exist, which is a nice, interesting surprise that I found out as we were getting ready for this episode. And I've already hit major targets at sea. And this basically shows that we're not going to be relying purely on to see in the sky or things to see in the sea. But my question is that if they then use AI as a component of what's to stop governments from using them or turning them in on their own?
It is a government's responsibility, and it's the responsibility of the operator, in this case, whether it's the Air Force or whoever it is, to ensure that civilians or non-combatants are not harmed by these systems. It's not only the drones, but any weapons employed in war. It is the that is using those ones. It is their responsibility to make sure that no innocent people are harmed. Yeah.
Should there be an overall?
And all that is covered in the law of conflict.
Sure.
Yeah. It is,
and yet
you can be arraigned in court for that.
Sure, and yet the laws are there, and because of that, you have establishments that handle folks who then have broken the law per se. So that already takes into consideration that it's possible that there would be an abrogation of some of these things. So when you look at accountability. If you look at war crimes, for example, you have the ICC. If you look at atomic energy, you have the IAEA. So who's the accountability body for this? Is there one? Should there be one for the African continent? Who makes sure that everybody is ticking the boxes?
There is. There's a act that deals with this.
Yes. With drones.
Specifically, this is what I'm saying.
Not drones.
Who's going to make sure that folks? Who's going to make sure that folks are using these things? Like you said, government should be responsible, should be accountable to make sure that things like collateral damage don't happen. But who's the body that's going to ensure that this everybody's following the rules?
I don't see a case where you can go and buy an armed drone in a shop.
No.
I'll take two of those.
While you're taking your shopping for your bananas. Yeah.
No. Those are preserved for
military
people, or law enforcement might have one or two drones. It is not something you can walk into a shop and buy. So those are governed under the laws of the War Convention and all that on how you can use it. Yeah, and the military is trained on how to conduct war without harming innocent people.
Oh, okay. So are these things constantly updated? Because if you look at things like the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law, a lot of these things came out 1949, 1950, when we've just come out 4 years from the World War. And for sure, there was not as much as sophisticated warfare as we see today. So are these laws enhanced? Do we have people who are currently tweaking things to say, okay, now with the advancement, with the sophistication of technology, even in warfare, then we're going to also have to tweak our laws?
Yes. And it is not just the individual countries. It is under the same convention.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's provisions for it within
those laws are updated.
Yes.
With the new weapon systems and all that. Yeah. It's all about information mainly. Yeah. The armed part of it is a new thing. The drones were basically about information gathering. So it's just recently that we started arming them. And it's based on fighting against terrorists and all that. You know that can hang about for a long time. Yeah, so you have a drone that can hang about for a long time waiting for something to pop up, which you couldn't do with airplanes. So, and now, as you see what is happening in war. So it's evolving, continue to evolve, and we're getting more and more use for drones. It will continue evolving.
Indeed.
Okay. Thank you so much, Colonel Shava, for coming in to talk to us. I mean, drones, I think we could talk ad infinitum about drones. And maybe next time we'll do a show with a drone. We can...
And actually see how it works.
Basically,
Indeed.
And I'm sure it's for you, even having been in the Air Force and done planes, this is an interesting area for continuous, just looking at it going forward. And I'm sure we'll have this conversation again sometime soon.
Sure.
War today is no longer confined to the battlefield. It is fought in the cloud, in algorithms, and in the minds of citizens scrolling their phones. A fake video can sway an election. A satellite constellation can decide whether an army has comms or goes dark. AI can scan faces in a crowd as easily as it can target an enemy on the front line. But alongside this digital front, the physical battlefield is also changing, and the defining weapon of the 21st century is the drone. Small, silent, and cheap, drones are forcing the world to rethink what war looks like. to help us think this through, we're joined by Ralph Goff, who spent 35 years with the CIA, serving as chief of station across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. He brings not just an intelligence lens, but first-hand experience from Ukraine, where the future of warfare is already unfolding in real time.
Thank you so much for joining us, Ralph. Welcome to this virtual Kenya, as it were, but we're really pleased that you're here. Karibu, as we like to say.
Good afternoon, Kenya, and good afternoon, Africa. It's great to be here virtually, although it's always much better to be there in person, so I look forward to my next trip.
The invitation is always open. Right, so now you have spent decades with the CIA in some of the toughest theaters of the world. I want to start this very simply. What can't you talk about in terms of what's off the tables, what's off limit when you talk to people like us?
So, my former employer has a pretty robust set of guidelines and rules, and I try to stay within them now that I'm retired. And basically what they don't like is like specific locations, right? For instance, you said I was a station chief in Europe and Middle East, so I'm really not allowed to say exactly which countries. It comes from back in the old days when cover considerations were very strict.
Okay.
I also cannot talk about specific sources or specific methods in specific cases, but there is so much out there in the public realm now that I can make a lot of reference to that thanks to all the books and movies and reporting. There's a lot I can comment on without actually getting myself in any trouble there.
Right. So you've just come back from the Ukraine. At least that we can talk about, I assume. You've seen life under constant drone, missile, and information warfare. A country relying on private data streams, like firms like Hawkeye 360, adapting its electronic warfare tactics every 8 to 12 weeks. We see that. From that experience, make the connection for us and tell us, what does it tell you about Africa's readiness? Are its militaries plugged into anything comparable, or does that information gap mostly serve outside powers?
So that information gap, Africa, I'm sure is way behind, but they're aware and studying. But look, so is Europe, so is NATO, so is the United States, right? Anything, frankly, anyone outside that battleground is behind. Like you said, 8 to 12 weeks, is kind of like the evolutionary time cycle for innovation out there. And, the Ukrainians, they managed to have a slight advantage in innovation, right, which is keeping them in the game here because they're fighting a much larger, much more heavily equipped foe. And also they're fighting a foe that doesn't care about humanitarian losses, right? The Ukrainians do. They try to conserve their manpower, whereas it's very clear that Vladimir Putin really doesn't care. I mean, the Russian forces have lost over 1 million men, right? Killed, wounded, captured, removed from the battlefield. And 2 years ago, if someone had told me that the Russians would suffer 1 million losses, I would have said, it'll be over long before that. But it's not, and it continues to this day. So, Africa is no further behind than NATO or the United States, believe me.
So now, today, it is drones pretty much in the sky, cyber attacks on networks, and AI crunching battlefield data. By 2030, apparently, RAND reports nearly half of combat engagements will involve AI-assisted decisions. So my question to you is, with many African militia, or militaries, not necessarily militia, African militaries still struggling on logistics and doctrine, how ready is the continent for this new phase of warfare?
So, again, I'll say the continent is no less prepared than is NATO and the United States, right? So take heart, Africa. You're not any further behind than anybody else right now, although I think, it's going to be a question not just of innovation, but of resources. Now, what operates in Africa's favor, frankly, to close the gap is, your youthful population and the fact that technology is getting simpler, right? Young people, particularly, that grow up with this technology, they learn very quickly, right? So, I mean, I've seen the younger generations in Africa, they're just as tech savvy as anybody else in the world. So, technology is kind of the great equalizer here, but unfortunately, it's the funding that will be an issue. So African countries, they will be looking to find ways to fund their evolutionary development of drone warfare.
So technology doesn't change necessarily how wars are fought. It changes who gets to fight them. When we look at this over time,
it's kind of both. I mean, it's still boots on the ground. It's still trenches. It's still tanks.
Okay.
Right. You look at Ukraine; they're still all there. But the drones, and it's not just drones in the air; it's drones on the ground now. The last time I was there, I visited a couple of Ukrainian factories that produce ground robots, right? That carry machine guns or can remove wounded soldiers from the field, right? Carry supplies. There's a 20 to 30 kilometer wide front along the front lines that's becoming increasingly dominated by drones and increasingly lethal for human beings.
So do we see a situation where we are experiencing the democratization of conflict or warfare if we see that some African countries now are able to purchase, experience what it is to fight or to have sophisticated weapons or sophisticated technology that will enable them to fight wars? Does that then level the playing field more?
Absolutely. There definitely is I like your term, the democratization of the forces there. This absolutely does allow smaller, less affluent countries to purchase technology, right? And it's the same with big data, right? Big data is increasingly available in ever greater amounts, and as AI comes online, that data will be more properly exploited, more properly utilized by governments, by militaries, right? So there is a lot of, as you called it, democratization here in this field.
Okay, now we've seen how easily basically a lot of these conflicts can escalate beyond borders, bringing other people in. Earlier this year, I believe, it was earlier this year, a Russian drone actually strayed into Polish territory during the Ukraine conflict. It didn't spark a NATO war, but it rattled a lot of nerves. That hit the headlines everywhere, basically. What does that kind of misstep tell us about escalation risks in a drone-driven world in general? And we can drill it down then to Africa, where borders are a bit more porous and conflicts tend to spill over them. But let's look at it from that kind of misstep. The implications for drone-driven world. Yeah.
So first of all, that particular incursion, it was more like 19 drones, right? I've heard 19 to 23. It was more than one. And I've also heard that the drones were not armed. They were decoy drones. So it wasn't so much, one or two drones, that's a misstep. 19 or 20 drones, that's a deliberate probe, right? This was Vladimir Putin's gamemanship at its best, right? He used these drones to see how NATO react. He's constantly probing NATO. He's looking for divisions in the unity of the NATO countries, and there are some that are there, right? And so his mission was accomplished because NATO, right, they really didn't do much about it. They scrambled some planes. They tried to shoot some down. They weren't very successful. But, what was interesting is the drones that the Russians used, 19 or 20 drones, was probably worth a total of a few $100,000 in equipment, right? The jets and the missiles and the radars and all the technology that NATO had to use to respond cost in the millions of dollars, right? So there's a great inequality there, and Putin used that to his advantage. To remind the West that their technology is behind his, right, in terms of drone warfare, and B, to see how NATO would respond. Now in Africa, exactly. Borders are a bit harder to define there, particularly in the more distant, darker regions of the continent. So mistakes will happen, and drones. No one really panics over one or two drones, but 20, 30. And in the future, the future of drone warfare, we're talking about drone swarms, right?
Yes.
Where we may have tens or hundreds of drones, particularly as AI comes online. You mentioned the 2030 projection, right? When you have an AI-controlled drone swarm that's free of any kind of human impediments, right? On the one hand, it reduces the mistakes because they're programmed. On the other hand, if there's a human error in the programming, the chance for a miscalculation or a mistake is even greater. So, we're really entering unknown territory here in terms of the future of drone warfare.
Looking at how then these conflicts over time then develop and what people are then able to do with these drones is, if technology lowers the cost of conflict, does that risk making wars more frequent? If it's easy for me to purchase what I need in this day and age as a nation, then do we run the risk of everybody going to war when they can?
That is a huge danger. I mean, because, when you buy something, you're tempted to use it, right? But, there are other factors. For instance, you look at the horrible threat of nuclear warfare, where you have the major powers, Russia, China, the United States, right, in possession of nuclear weapons. And so far to date, thank God, we have not had a nuclear war amongst the powers, right? So at the same time, as weapons become, as weapons or weapon systems proliferate, there is a danger of warfare. But, if you have with them also evolution of government control and evolution of policy, right? People become aware of the dangers, the controls become more robust. So the same thing with drones in the future. I mean, governments will look for a way to, ensure that these things are not misused by a neighbor or a foe.
Well, that's interesting that you say that, because then looking into the element of control, it's arguably that Americans make the most capable AI systems. And yet, US forces also sometimes do struggle with absorbing and deploying them. Difficult sometimes, right? So the capability is as much organizational as it is technological. So when you look at that and say, so obviously who created the thing controls it? And if we're looking at a different kind of warfare or different kind of conflict, should African nations then focus on guarding against risks, or should they build their own AI capacity?
So I think, we in the agency, we like to stay in the gray zone, so I'll stay gray here.
All right.
It's both, right? I think you're going to have to develop your own AI models. You're going to, you're going to have to import, right? You're going to have to rely on AI algorithms and technologies from other countries, but then you're going to have to take them and adapt them to your own needs. You're going to have to train your own people, right? It's like any kind of technology where if you import it from abroad, if you don't have your own indigenous capability to control it, to develop it, to tailor it to your specific needs, right? Then you lose a lot of control over that, right? Like the last thing you want is to have a technology from China, say, and then you need the Chinese to maintain it, the Chinese to upgrade it, the Chinese to control it, because then you have no control, right? And so with Africa, I think with your talented youth and focusing on education systems there, you guys can definitely develop your own indigenous controls over these systems and over this technology.
Okay. Now, we have talked a lot about threats. What about defenses? Something that we've not brought up yet. Which countermeasures have actually proven effective in conflicts? I don't know how much information you have about the African conflicts and the aspect of how that has worked, but let's look at it from a general, which countermeasures have actually proven effective? If you can drill it down into the African context, that would be fantastic. And act as an advisor, right? An advisor to governments in Africa today. Where would you tell them to invest first?
So, countermeasures at this point, and I'm going to make reference more to Ukraine because that's where where all the evolution is taking place.
Yep.
The best countermeasure so far, it's drone on drone.
Okay.
Right. Right now, at the front, some of the units I met, one of the consistent themes I heard was that the top targets for Ukrainian drone operators are Russian drone operators. The top targets for Russian drone operators were the Ukrainian drone operators.
Okay.
Right? Earlier in the conflict, it wasn't quite that way. Earlier in the conflict, last year even, the drone operators, they felt fairly safe, right? But now they are the main target. And so, drone technology is being used to uncover other drone technology, right? And it's like spy versus spy. There's always measure, countermeasure, measure, countermeasure, right? And the same thing will prove true in Africa. Right? You'll be when one country develops a drone capability, another country will have to develop a capability to counter that. And currently, like I said, in Ukraine, it's drone against drone.
So when we're looking at legitimacy, or in a situation where legitimacy is already fragile, how destabilizing can the likes of deepfakes be for governments and societies? I know we've shifted gear quite considerably, but we're looking at now, warfare not beyond the actual physical and or weapons. Now looking at misinformation, disinformation, deepfakes, and things like that. So now, how does that create stability?
Yeah, look, you've touched on a massive issue there, and look, it's not just limited to Africa, where it's astounding to think 400 African elections were affected by information warfare, and you've got it absolutely right. Information warfare is just that; it is warfare, right? When you think of kinetic warfare on the battlefield or cyber warfare in the cyber realm, now we're talking about cognitive and informational warfare, which can be just as destructive. I mean, deep fakes, misinformation, disinformation that can cause a government to fall or cause the wrong candidate to be elected, right? That's as destructive as a kinetic attack or a cyber attack. So this is a huge concern. And, in the West, in the United States and in Europe, they're struggling to deal with this, frankly. And, it's our adversarial countries, Russia, China, North Korea, right? I mean, North Korea, here's a country that doesn't even really have an internet, and yet they have developed a cadre of cyber specialists that, are amongst the best in the world. I mean, the North Korean hackers literally steal billions of dollars, both from cryptocurrency or from banks every year, right? A small country, like I said, that doesn't even have an open internet system for the people, yet somehow they managed to create a cadre of incredibly talented cyber activists, right? Well, these adversaries, because they're not limited by any legal constraints, right? For instance, in the West, as a CIA guy, I can tell you that, when we engage in information warfare, we actually have some very strict rules that we have to follow. For instance, we're mostly constrained to use the truth. And,
funny thing,
which I don't have a problem with. I think the truth is a powerful weapon, right? But our adversaries are not, right? I mean, you look at the Russians, and every time they give a speech at the UN or every time they speak on television, I mean, literally everything coming out of their mouths is untrue.
So this is talking to the ethical use of information warfare.
Yeah,
the ethical use of information warfare.
Yeah, and they back it up with deep fakes. They back it up with altered data. They back it up with, an incredible capability of using bots, right? I mean, I go to some of my feeds on LinkedIn or on Telegram or something like that, and I tell you, I know a lot of the stuff that I see in response to some of my content are bots.
Answering you.
And they're good.
So, I mean, you give rise to the reality of our times that nations could be on the brink of failure based on untruths like this. We've seen it happen on the African continent already. So, and anybody with a laptop, just like you said, can manufacture anything and make it go viral just because of what technology allows folks to do today. So, if you were to be in an advisory role, what should folks do? What should African states and groups do to defend themselves from anybody with a laptop that can manufacture an untruth?
So, I think a lot of your listeners will find this ironic coming from a retired CIA guy, but, my advice would be that African states need to develop, not just the expertise in operating in the information realm, but transparency in government. The best weapons against deep fakes, the best weapons against our adversaries we need more transparency in government. Right? We need a media that is reliable and trusted. Right? Here in the United States, we have huge problems with trusted media. Right? To the point where, the algorithms, because they control your content, people are essentially getting their news from sources that just tell them what they want to hear.
Not what they need to hear.
Not what they need to hear, right? And so, African countries need to develop really, like I said, I think the top two weapons are transparency in government, so that people trust government, so that when a government spokesman comes out and says, hey, this is a deep fake, there's no truth here, right? People will tend to believe them, as opposed to if there's lack of transparency, they'll say, well, if this person says it's a deep fake, then I think it's real, right? And the same with the media. Then you need a strong, open, free, reliable media that people can trust. Those are the two greatest weapons, I think, against this type of warfare.
And in that itself, then you have to be able to basically track and counter. So it's all well and good to say, okay, fine, but how do you track it, and how do you actually counter disinformation? And that ecosystem often relies, especially at least from the perspective of the African continent, intelligence networks, such as the CIA and various other intelligence networks. But African states tend to depend very heavily on partners, the US, France, and even private contractors, actually. So how can the continent balance its own sovereignty with the need to benefit from trusted partners? And what's the long-term upside of governments getting this balance right?
Yeah. I'm glad you put it in those terms of balancing partnerships with sovereignty. That's important, right? And I look at when I look at the Ukraine conflict again, right? Something I'm more familiar with. I look at who's lined up, right? You look at, on the one side, you've got the United States, you've got Europe, right? Basically aligned against Russia. And who's on Russia's side, right? There's China in the background, but you have North Korea, you have Iran, right? Strong supporters there, right? So, I always said, it's not just a battle on the battlefield, it's a battle of values, because you have these Western values are pitted against these totalitarian values. And the same thing takes place in countries of Africa. And therefore, partners seek like partners. Now, what also overshadows the Ukraine conflict, are the BRIC countries, right? Or the non-aligned countries.
Yeah.
They're watching this conflict. India, of course, is benefiting from cheap oil and gas from Russia. Brazil, they tend to lean a little bit more towards Ukraine, but they are watching this conflict because they're still trying to decide on which side to support. Right? They're looking at this, what was for a while, first we had a bipolar world between the United States and the Soviet Union and our allies. Then we had a unipolar world where the United States, enjoyed some hegemony there while Russia and other countries developed, right? But now we've got this new multipolar world, right? Which means the centers of gravity of information have been split and divided, right? And so the non-aligned countries are looking and they're deciding. I think a lot will depend on the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war, right? And they'll decide where to line up further in the future. And for Africa, it's crucial, I think, that they also decide which value system is in their best interest.
African militaries depend heavily on foreign satellites for communication. We know this. And also coordination. We have Starlink, which operates more than 8,000 satellites. China plans to launch over 1,000 through SatNet by 2030. So what risks does this dependency create for African states that don't control the infrastructure that they rely on?
Yeah, huge risk there. Absolutely. It's just like getting back to any aspect of information control where, if you don't control the sources of information, you're at other countries' mercy. If you don't control the means of transmitting, the means of disseminating information, you're also at a disadvantage. And the space is no different. And this is getting back to your question on partnerships. This means, not only are intelligence partnerships important, but technological partnerships. And, you look at, satellite companies. I think the greatest potential for Africa are partnerships in the private sector, right? For instance, one example would be a company like Maxar, which is based out of Colorado, which became very famous because they're a commercial imagery company that was competing with NASA and other government agencies and they were producing high quality imagery, photographs, videos, things like that from space that, wasn't that expensive and any country could afford. So, African countries, there will be options for them in the private sector. And, it's just like the space race in the Cold War, right? Was a race between the Soviet Union and the United States, who would get to the moon first. And those were the governments, right? In the 60s, the best engineers, the best mathematicians, the best physicists, right? In the United States, they went to NASA. Right? They worked for the government. That's no longer true, right? Government is where technology goes to die now. Right? So, these top people, they go to the private sector, right? And the beauty about the private sector is it's largely open to open market forces. So Africa can compete on that, particularly as the prices come down. This is the other benefit for with development of AI and information technology is it becomes cheaper, it becomes more affordable for African countries. And again, Africa, look, the economic boom that's underway in Africa now is only going to grow as the world's reliance or search for raw materials increases. So I think the future can be bright for Africa in terms of taking more of an ownership stake in satellite technology.
So we're talking about alignment. Depending whether, alignment and being able to bring in private entities that can actually deal with it. But then how do you then, there's also an aspect of accessibility. If for whatever reason I have a dependency on a foreign player or foreign state or whatever the case may be, and they decide they're going to cut me off for whatever reason, maybe I didn't pay them off or whatever the case may be, then that brings a lot of different parameters, a lot of different moving wheels, because now you're reliant on aspect of software designs and things like that. So if I don't have access to those, how do I then how is my sovereignty then still kept in place, especially when it comes to this kind of aspect? I'm just rambling at the moment, but how do I guarantee my sovereignty?
Yeah, no, that's a very legitimate concern. And again, you mentioned Starlink earlier. We can use that as an example, where in Ukraine there was a point where when the Ukrainians launched a large counteroffensive back in 2023, right? Part of their offensive stalled because Elon Musk turned off Starlink.
Right.
Right. The Ukrainians were very reliant on it. And I can tell you on all my visits to Ukraine since, right, they talk about how important Starlink is and how much reliance they have on it. But they also talk about they're looking for alternatives. They're looking to develop their own alternatives, right? And they will. The Ukrainians, they're innovative people, and they will get around that. And, the same will hold true for Africa. Avoiding monopolies will be crucial. And this will turn around back to your youthful population investing in education, right? Bringing people up so that they can develop their own algorithms. They can develop I'm sure there's more than one future African Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk actually comes from South Africa originally anyways. But
so we can claim him.
You can have him.
Wow.
Wait, was that my outside voice?
That's all right.
No, I mean, again, it all gets back to investment in the future. And with the African continent, it means African countries developing programs to invest in education, to develop the capabilities. And meanwhile, again, as these technologies become cheaper, right, and more accessible for African countries, particularly as the value of your resources and the value of your or the marketability of your resources grows, I think the prospects are pretty good for it.
So the frontier is not just above us, Ralph. It's also beneath. And we've seen that, underwater drones are used to expand naval reach. We've seen China investing heavily in this. Would they shape not just maritime security, but Africa's control over its waters and resources, noting that Africa's waters for the longest time have been used by external forces for control? There have been conversations between other governments and Africa's countries who have a port or who have water surrounding them. Is this an opportunity for Africa to be able to control its own waters and resources?
Absolutely. It's like controlling any of your borders, whether they're land borders or maritime borders, right? The African countries that are, have coastlines, have access to waters, right? They will have to look at developing systems that control these borders. As far as China, China, they've invested heavily in purchasing or, incurring through debt the port infrastructure of African countries, right? So at this point, they really don't have a need to deploy underwater drones to try and control the approaches. They already control the ports, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the railways that lead to the ports, right? So, first, I think African countries are going to have to work to, regain control over this critical infrastructure, right? Then they can worry more about the littoral and the ocean areas. But, it's a multi-domain issue, right? Space, land, underground, water, it's all. And we're seeing that in Ukraine, where they've developed probably the leading technologies in drones that operate on the surface of the sea and underneath. Ukraine is a country that lacks a navy, and yet they've destroyed a third of the Russian Black Sea fleet and bottled it up far off to the east, right? So, African countries, I think, can study what worked for Ukraine in terms of maritime security in drones. Okay. I think one of the worst drones I've ever heard about, though, is the Russians developed a system. It's an underwater torpedo, basically a drone. It's equipped with a thermonuclear warhead, and it's designed to be used in the event of a nuclear war where Russia and the United States have already basically destroyed each other. And this thing can autonomously seek out a target, launch, and it travels at a high rate of speed because it's powered by a nuclear engine, right? Mm-hmm. And they just point it in the direction of San Francisco and let her fly, right?
Wow.
And it's more of a revenge weapon than anything else. The Russians are really good at the concept of revenge, but it's really a twisted take on underwater drones, and it's one of the scarier things I've heard about. But it just shows that this thing was developed, I guess, 10 years ago or so. But it shows that the Russians and the Chinese and others have been paying attention to the underwater domain as well as the skies.
Okay, I want to start bringing this conversation home.
Okay.
And this might be a bit okay. I'm going to ask it anyway because it's just fun to have you on, and it's great in terms of the information that you're giving, and I'm sure a lot of our
listeners. Guys have great questions. Let me tell you, great questions.
we try.
Really impressive.
We try. Right. So we're looking at the typical narrative of what warfare has always been about. For years, basically, Africa's conflicts have been framed as war on terror. We got Somalia, we got the Sahel, parts of Nigeria as well. East Africa gets pulled into that conflict as well. But many argue that the real drivers are actually, and this was something that I suppose it touches on the aspect of drones, because the most expensive component of drones is actual semiconductors. And semiconductors are made from certain minerals. So people argue that the real drivers of are actual minerals, energy, and access. Right? Statistically, from 2010 to 2025, investment in African critical minerals grew sixfold, turning mines and transit routes into flashpoints. My question to you is, how much of Africa's security story is really about terrorism, and how much is about the actual resources?
Oh man, I tell you, that is a great question. I love that one, and you've really brought this home in a great way, because this is where it all stems from, right? Again, referring to Africa as a continent of possibilities, and a continent where the mineral resources, the energy resources that are untapped, unmapped even at this point, right, are great. And you look at these struggles, and the drivers here are not just ideological. It's not just a question of religion, right? It's all centered on economics, right? I think all wars throughout history, the basic causes have been economic when you get right down to it. And so these are no different. And for the Sahel and other areas where, Islamic terrorism seems to be on the rise, right? It's a reflection of dissatisfaction with the status quo in terms of economic potential. Populations are dissatisfied. They seek answers. They seek solutions. They turn to, participation in terror groups. And then there's foreign meddling, right? You look at, for instance, the Wagner Group, which kind of is no longer, but is now the Africa Corps, which is run by the Russian Ministry of Defense, right? They're very present, very visible on the African continent. And, you have these foreign mercenaries basically stirring up the populace, right? They tend to be hired by totalitarian regimes, right, who will spend anything and take any measures to remain in power. And that only further empowers the extremists, right, who are seeking to overthrow these governments, overthrow these totalitarian regimes, right? And again, that's economics. They want control over that, because if you control the minerals and the energy, you can buy the weapons, you can pay for the mercenaries, you can keep your power. Although, it's short-term gain, but long-term disaster for the continent of Africa. So, and this is the mystery of Africa. This is the dilemma, right? It's future development, right? You have this huge promise, this huge potential, right? This exploding youth population that has great potential in terms of learning and becoming masters of their destiny, right? And then all these minerals and energy and all these resources that not only is the rest of the world clamoring for, but Africa will need to sustain its own growth, right? But that's all stymied when you have regimes that control them or foreign interference that controls them, right? These are the problems that Africa will have to overcome in the coming decade. And, drones, information warfare, AI, these will all be tools which will either make Africa successful or will further hinder them. The jury's still out on that.
Indeed. So we're looking at a world that's constantly changing, and even in the aspects of warfare, and looking into the future, even as we round this up, Rolf, is that can we see that the agency might have done things differently in Africa, or that you personally would have done differently when it comes to these things that we've discussed, Rolf?
Oh, I really like that question too, and it's very personal. Look, I think the biggest mistake from the agency, and we have to be careful here because, the Hollywood version of the CIA is very inaccurate. In Hollywood, the CIA is this independent, rogue, right, organization that does what it wants. Right?
That's what I was expecting.
Yeah,
right? That's
is it not?
It's glamorous and sexy in movies.
It's not all. That's true. Of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, but starting in the 70s, that started to be less and less true, to the point where the agency is it's a government bureaucracy, right? I mean, for every moment of excitement that I had in my career, I had hours of drudgery, right? Hours of paperwork and boredom in an office. But the agency is one lever of influence that the United States government as a whole can wield, right? And in Africa, I thought it was poorly wielded. I think a better tool that the United States had was foreign aid, which now has been, cut and reduced. And, we're still waiting to see what direction the new relatively new Trump administration will take when they restore this aid, right? That was the best tool. The agency, I think the mistakes we made where over the years, we kind of looked at Africa as less important than some of the other areas, right? So we had a presence in the country, then we closed it, right? And then a few years later, we had to go back, right? Or we didn't resource them properly with personnel. So we never understood. If you don't have enough intelligence operatives in a country collecting, right, you don't get a clear picture of what's happening. And I think there were decades where the United States, we had the Africa component of the CIA was one of the small, right? But they were very elite. They were very proud. The people who really became what we call our African experts they had great pride. They took great pleasure in the time they spent in Africa and the cultures and the languages and the people that they learned there, right? But they were always a smaller scale. And I think the biggest mistake was that the agency didn't scale up, didn't take advantage of the fact that African countries actually were very welcoming and very great places for our officers to operate, because once they understood the culture and the language, there was so much they could learn. And I think that put the United States government way behind the curve in terms of understanding what was happening in Africa and what was coming in the future. And I think a lot of the chaos that we see today in Africa, in parts of Africa, is based on the failure of the U.S. intelligence agencies to properly resource and staff and collect and understand Africa. We were behind the curve.
First time that they may have come out in public.
she's going to shoot me for what I'm about to use now. Just a quick one, because you mentioned about the aspect of that partnership aspect. But I was thinking in terms of if you had more agency here. But okay, if I wanted, what is one study to become a CIA agent?
This is the future for Waweru.
I'm not too old.
I mean, I was a liberal arts guy, so
Okay.
Technology is definitely not my thing. But these days, they're looking for people who can read and write and understand, and they're looking for people who understand technology. It's a wide realm, and it depends on, will you be an analyst, right, or will you be someone like me, what we call a case officer, a street officer, right, or will you be a tech person, right? There's a wide variety of careers there, and a wide variety of skill sets that are needed. And and this is the beauty of a place like Africa, where you have such a large and diverse population, where you can grow your own spies there.
That's what I was getting
where
at.
he was going,
that's the direction and you just led me there. Thank you.
Ralph, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having this conversation with us today. Just being able to look at the different things, nuanced or otherwise, that have happened over the years, and to be able to look into the future. So, Ralph, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Panel 54.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you. Thank you. That's it for this episode of Panel 54, where we rethink the world one African perspective at a time. If today's conversation made you pause, reflect, or reframe, share it, start a conversation, and tag us in. Find us on our social media handle at Panel54Pod, your favorite streaming platform. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode.
Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember, keep the lens clean.